Wow, okay, so lucky last, maybe not, after those three speakers. Hopefully I can live up to the exceptional standard and just engaging, amazing stories that we've heard so far. Thank you so much, echoing the other speakers, to Mick for bringing us all together. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the other speakers for sharing such amazing expertise and insights. A little bit about me, Heidi Hauf. I grew up on the Sunshine Coast and have lived all over the world, mostly working in sustainability. I think my sustainability career started by growing up on the Sunshine Coast. It was just such an incredible natural ecosystem and natural wonders to wow kids into learning about science and how we engage with science to be part of and protect the world around us. I started my actual career though in the Australian Army as an intelligence officer, and through that role I got to see what we would now call unsustainable development. Australia at the time was very much involved in regional development, peacekeeping, nation building, and humanitarian assistance to natural and human-made disasters. And I saw poor governance, bad use of natural resources, waste inefficiencies, linear non-circular systems, and I didn't know at the time that that was unsustainable development, but I thought, wouldn't it be great to be part of something that was, if you think of that as a pipeline, trying to be at the top of the pipe and stop some of those things happening rather than fixing them at the end. And I found out that was sustainable development. So when I ended my career in the military, I started building a career in that space. I moved to the UK, and most of the time since, I've been spending there and across Europe, Africa, and US, and now Asia Pacific, working on projects in the sustainability space. A lot of the time with corporates, but also in policy. And I've worked across different sectors, health, fast-moving consumer goods, and most recently, aviation. It's been amazing to have some insights into heavy industry manufacturing, and also a hard-to-abate sector and the challenges that bring to us, particularly to our economy here in Australia. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to what you've heard from the other speakers, and that's kind of representing a sector, I guess, and giving you a bit of an oversight into how aviation is tackling sustainability and how it contributes to the SDGs. And I think it's relevant because really it touches all of us. I think without even a show of hands, I think I confidently say aviation impacts every person in this room individually, but also the work that you do and the supply chains that you might be part of. So without having to remind any of you about how important aviation is, I think it's important just to note up front that it really does underpin so much of what Australian GDP relies on. It connects us to the rest of the world. It connects us to each other. We are very dispersed geographically. It's one of those industries that inspires young people into STEM and studying STEM, aerospace more broadly, and particularly nowadays space. And we need that regardless of whether they're going to come and work in the aviation industry. We need young people with those skills and that curiosity for how the world works and how we can create solutions to tackle some of our sustainability challenges. Yet, aviation is really still only enjoyed by a privileged few globally. So only around 10% of the global population fly regularly. And aviation contributes 2.5 to 3% of global carbon emissions. And if you look at just the transport sector, it's 12% of that. And as other sectors start taking up readily available and commercially viable technologies, aviation will start being a much larger portion of the emissions profile globally. So, aviation really does touch on all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I've got a few that I want to just highlight here and point out, I guess, where aviation contributes, but also on the flip side, where aviation has a long way to go and some of the work that's being done to tackle some of the challenges there. So let's take Sustainable Development Goal number 2, tackling zero hunger. Did you know that 70,000 tonnes of food is airlifted into humanitarian assistance and crisis zones around the world each year? So it plays a huge role. Similarly, in good health and well-being, I don't think any of us need to be reminded that during the pandemic, aviation played a really important role in getting vaccines, and PPE, and medical personnel to the world, but around Australia. Aviation also plays a really important role in sustainable communities and cities. And if you think particularly in the Pacific, in the South Pacific, we have very isolated communities, and the opportunity to connect people through aviation really does bring economic opportunities. Aviation supported in 2023 over 86 million jobs globally, and over $4 trillion US in economic activity. So it really does underpin so much of what we think about in our in economic activity and in the industries that we're all part of. It also contributes to decent work and economic growth. Most recently, I was working for the Boeing Corporation, and the amount of engineers in that sector and that were employed by Boeing in Australia was huge, a huge STEM and internship program. However, on the flip side, in particularly relating to both decent work and the gender inequality goals of the SDGs, although the aviation industry has done a lot of work in the last 10 years to improve gender equality and representation, and as an overall industry, we see somewhere in the mid-30s as far as female representation in the workforce. In the highly technical areas, there's only an average of around 5% representation of women, and those also happen to be the areas that are highly paid. So when we just look at gender the influence of that on gender pay gap, it's massive. The WGEA report that comes out annually here in Australia, you can go and have a look at where our two major airlines sit and their gender pay gap, but I can tell you it's not great. And they are doing a lot because it's a really complex thing to tackle. We actually have a lot of young women coming into the workforce. There's a lot of kind of systemic workplace career development challenges that we need to face to keep those women and bring them back after any breaks from work. So a lot of work for aviation to do there, and that's something that we need to collaborate on. And the other one that we need a lot of work to do in is renewable energy and our climate action. Aviation is a hard to abate sector, and so what that means is that there is no commercially viable technology that's ready just to apply and start immediately reducing our emissions and perhaps even eliminating our emissions. And what we're going to do now, we're going to take a little joy flight through some of the challenges and some of the pathways that aviation as a sector is taking to tackle particularly this last point, and it involves renewable fuels. A few considerations as I take you into those pathways, and they are challenges, but they can, as with all the challenges, can be opportunities. So as we look towards 2050, the first thing that's important to remember or to tell you about is that as an industry, both at the UN level, so nation states committing their industries, the aviation industries, but also as an industry from IATA, the industry body, globally, we've committed to reaching net zero by 2050. And there are a lot of challenges in getting there, but that commitment is the first step. The other thing to think about is, as we look towards 2050, there are huge changes afoot in our workplace. We obviously had Corey talking about AI revolution, how we live and work and therefore travel, and the way that aviation fits into intermodal travel, how it can actually facilitate lower emissions in cities and regional areas, but also across regions and around the world, is something that we need to think about very deliberately, and how we don't just plug what we've done into the future. We think differently about how we deploy technologies like air taxis and other things. The other thing to think about is that aviation is just one of the industries that requires a lot of energy that will be transitioning. So there's resources, whether that be natural resources or whether that be human skill resources, that are going to be needed to be shared across multiple different industries at exactly the same time. So where are those opportunities to collaborate and leverage each other so that all industries benefit from limited resources? And where do we need to actually make some hard decisions and prioritize resources to where they need to go for greatest benefit? And there's some very live questions in this space around the energy carriers for aviation. The other thing to think about on a time frame to 2050 is that aviation has particularly long innovation cycles. So the commercial jet aircraft that you might hear Virgin or Qantas are bringing in because they bought new planes, they will have a 30-year lifespan. And so they're just being introduced over the next 5 to 10 years, and they will have 30 years of life. And without major modifications to those aircraft, they're going to have to use the energy systems that they're designed for, i.e. liquid fuels, for that time. And that takes us up, or very close to 2050. So working with these very expensive, long lifespan infrastructure, and aviation's not the only one, rail's in a similar position and others, shipping. We have to think about how we tackle this in a smart way, but still make progress. We also have some pretty major pressures making us kind of go faster, and aviation has had a long history of innovating efficiencies into how it does business, particularly commercial aviation. Since the invention of the jet aircraft and commercial aviation as we know it, there's been a 50% decrease in the average emissions per carrier, per person. But we have, and rightfully so, a lot of attention us from the climate movement, and particularly from young people who are recognising the role of aviation to take a faster progress towards decarbonisation, and a lot of focus on greenwashing and overstatements from airlines and airports who are perhaps not being as clear in the communication about what's actually possible and what's a step towards emissions reduction. We've seen some policies come into play around the world, led mostly by the EU, but the US was doing some great stuff there for a while. It's kind of in stasis or retracting at the moment. But the momentum in this space, and particularly around renewable fuels, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, is definitely really promising. The national policy, so things like mandates or innovation targets around renewable fuels and reducing emissions in aviation really helps build investor confidence. It's one of the things that we need to bring some investment into the sustainable aviation fuel, renewable fuel space. It's a very big job to do to transfer fossil fuels, liquid fuels, into renewable fuels. So I'm going to take you quickly through the 4 pathways, as we like to call it in the industry, where aviation has an opportunity to reduce its emissions. And the first 2 on this slide that you can see are what we can do now, and they're somewhat incremental as far as the impact on emissions. But they're happening as we speak, so super important. First one's fleet renewal. As I said, we've got all our major airlines renewing their aircraft. This one does what it says. Every time you bring a new aircraft in, it's embedded with a whole bunch of efficiencies from the innovations since the last version of that aircraft was released. And you can see 15 to 25% emissions reduction, depending on what you're replacing and how you use that plane in your fleet. So it is something. And then operational efficiency is the other thing we can do. And I like to say that this is using all of the data around the aircraft, how it flies, how we maintain it, ground operations at an airport, to be as efficient as possible. So understanding flight degradation from the data of flight, controlling flight paths and takeoffs and landings, and single taxiing on the airport, on the hard standing. These things in accumulation can be 10 to 12% emissions reduction. So again, quite significant. These next 2 are much more transformational in the amount of emissions that they can bring to the industry. And so the first one is renewable energy. I've hinted at the role of renewable fuels, but green electrons are going to serve the aviation industry as much as every other industry. We need as many green electrons as we can, and we need to draw on some of those to make some green hydrogen for some smaller scale regional aircrafts. And we need to use renewable energy in making renewable aviation fuel, sustainable aviation fuel. And advanced technologies. And this is anything from using AI to better manage air traffic management, ground operations, or help us use the data I explained earlier to be super efficient and find those cumulative small improvements that we can make. Now, I like to use this because it tells basically the story that I've just given you in the last 2 slides. This is a technology maturity matrix. Down the side, you can see commuter, regional, short haul, medium haul, long haul. That is the segmentation of aviation. It's based on hours flown or distance flown. And across the top, you can see a timeline from 2020 when this was produced out to 2050. You can also see down where the segmentation is a breakup of 30%, 70%. So you can see that commuter through to short haul distance flights, that makes up about 30% of global aviation emissions. And 70%, or just over actually, comes from medium and long haul flights. The technology other than sustainable aviation fuel really won't become viable for the longer haul flights, those flights that have the greatest impact on emissions, until 2040s and onwards. And what we're seeing already is some really amazing technologies in electrification, so air taxis and hydrogen fuel cell technology for sort of regional flights. And that should go on, and we should support that innovation, not least of which because we are drawing some of that knowledge into the larger OEMs, Boeing, Airbus, to improve the existing aircraft. But the power to weight ratio for these solutions are just not yet at a place where we'll be able to fly long haul. The more technology you bring into an aircraft, the heavier it is, including batteries, and the shorter distance that you can go. And there's a lot more technical way of describing it, but that's essentially all you need to understand. So what we need is some Nobel Prize winning moments where battery technology is radically improved, and we can put tiny, hardly, almost weightless batteries in planes and use that hydrogen electric and technology for long haul. Until then, sustainable aviation fuel is our answer. Now, sustainable aviation fuel is essentially taking a renewable feedstock rather than a fossil feedstock, and using the fuel pathway that most suits that energy conversion. So we can have, there's 11 actually different pathways you can turn feedstocks into sustainable aviation fuel. And if you can use renewable energy and capture carbon along the way, then you can have anything from 80 up to over 100% emissions reduction. The tailpipe emissions are still there. We're talking about the life cycle emissions of the fuel being produced. There's lots of benefits for making sustainable aviation fuel, and it's one of many biofuels. So renewable diesel is also a really important biofuel for Australian, particularly the resources industry. And one of which is that we are targeting regions and diversification of income for regional areas, and particularly farmers. So think about agricultural feedstocks or rotational crops. There are some pretty strict sustainability rules around what can be called a sustainable aviation fuel. And one of those is looking at the legal rights of landowners, and also looking at not replacing land that is used to grow food with fuel crops. So you can have a look at the Roundtable for Sustainable Biomaterials and some of their sustainability criteria, but it's very much a controlled space so that we don't have unintended consequences. I need to wrap up, but one of the things that I wanted to leave you with is that the job to be done is huge, and that's what you can see on the screen now. It's the modelling from IATA that shows just how much we need to increase the production of sustainable aviation fuel to reach that net zero by 2050. IATA has modelled that we need 65% of that emissions reduction for aviation will come from fuel, from sustainable aviation fuel. So we need to really ramp up that growth. And Australia has the potential to be a superpower in this space. We have a lot of agricultural resources and the skill sets to grow that industry. What can you do? Well, you can pay attention to the conversations around elections. Policy is super important here. We know that jurisdictions that are growing SAF industries have the incentives in policies to help grow that new industry. But also in your corporations, you can look into how you can bring SAF into your travelling offsets. So you can actually buy a proportion of your flight on SAF. May not be made here in Australia just yet, but it's made globally, and as it's a global industry, it has a huge impact. So they're the two things that I think that I'd like you to take away. Hopefully it's been a very quick little masterclass in how aviation is both contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals, but also areas where we have some real challenges and how we're tackling it. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. That was awesome.